Here's what a woman wrote into me. I have a lot of concern regarding your content. It is far from balanced and probably does more damage than good. Where do you get your research? What studies support your content? Do you address any form of accountability for men? Have you been abused in the past? Do you have healthy relationships with women? These are sincere questions I have, and I hope you reply. They're valid questions. They're reasonable and valid questions, legitimate questions for women to ask about me and my content when they find it or their husbands share it with them. So I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about triggers. Because as women, when we watch my content or women watch my content, I create my content and live it in my own life and have to look at myself. We get triggered. It's reasonable to assume that this woman asking these questions, because they're negative and critical and skeptical in nature, it's reasonable to assume that she was triggered. And it's reasonable to assume that every woman gets triggered when they watch my content, because even I get triggered and have to work through my issues when I plan my content each week. So let me explain what a trigger is, because a trigger or triggers happen all the time in our lives. They're so pervasive, they go undetected, and we can show up in our triggers in different ways. So they often go undetected, and we don't even realize when we're triggered, which is the whole purpose of a trigger. And it's a common pervasive experience that we have not only as women, but as humans. It's just part of life. So let me first define what a trigger is. I'm going to give an example, and then we'll bring it back to these questions. So a trigger is something. It could be a statement somebody says. It could be a picture. It could be an idea. It could be an ideological belief. It could be an event. It could be an interaction with another person. But it's something that causes a negative, internal, defensive reaction that serves as a protective mechanism to not have to see something negative about ourselves. So a trigger is something that would cause us to be vulnerable and cause us to see something that we don't want to see about ourselves. So I'm going to give a common example of a trigger. When your boss finds fault or a mistake in work that you have produced. The trigger, when your boss confronts you about a mistake or finding fault in a piece of work you produced, the trigger is you don't want to see in yourself that you've made a mistake. So in that trigger and being in that defensive, protective mode to not have to see something about yourself, instead of seeing it and owning up to making a mistake, in a trigger, you blame your boss for correcting you, or blame him for what he didn't do to support you to take the project or the work in the right direction. And that's the protective mechanism of the trigger and getting defensive, so that you do not have to look at yourself for the mistake that you made. That's a really, really common trigger that we've all experienced. So what happens in that, when we are triggered, we are unable to see the reality or the truth of the situation. In the trigger, our response is filtered through the blaming and looking at somebody else, not looking at ourselves and looking at the truth of what the situation really was. So using that example of getting triggered when your boss calls you out for a mistake you made or finds fault in something that you did in your work, someone would go to their friends, go to their families, complain about their boss and how awful their boss was, and be in their story of how their boss was in the wrong and what he did, instead of looking inward and saying, I did make that mistake. I took shortcuts. I rushed it. I didn't really give any effort into what I was doing. I just wanted to get it over with. That's what it would look like to feel the trigger of, oh, I got called out by my boss. I feel that. And then having to go in and see the reality of the situation, which is I made a mistake. I didn't do a good job. But as humans, we get defensive and we stay stuck in the trigger, and how we respond to a trigger when we're not willing to go in and see the truth and reality of the situation. You have to recognize then there is no truth or reality of our perception, because again, the trigger is a protective mechanism, so we don't have to look at ourselves. So when I do my videos each week, I have to resolve the triggers that come up in me and the topics that I'm presenting on and teaching about, of what I don't want to see through myself. And it's really important. I'm not perfect. Sometimes I don't catch something. I might get done with my video and like there's something unsettled in there and I have to do some work afterward. But most of the time I work through the triggers, because once I work through them, I have a fresh and clear perspective about what I'm teaching that I wouldn't be able to have if I was stuck in a trigger and not wanting to see something about myself in the concept that I'm teaching. So for today, and the questions that I read that were critical and negative of my work coming from a woman, the trigger in it for me today is that when I was stuck in the trigger and in that defensive protective mode within myself, I felt like she was criticizing me for what I do, and I felt attacked. And what I had to look at in myself then is how uncomfortable I still am in being criticized. Even if and she was pretty kind. It wasn't she wasn't attacking me. They were pretty level-headed, legitimate questions. But I still, in that trigger, I felt wrong. So I was saying, that's me. She didn't do that to me. That's my own weakness and crack in my foundation of still being uncomfortable being criticized. Still feeling uncomfortable, people not liking my message. That's about me, not what anyone or anything is doing to me. So then by working through that, then I could see her questions are valid. They're totally reasonable and legitimate. And this is why triggers in life, triggers are a gift. I have been taught triggers are my friend. They're uncomfortable. I don't always want to go there. They're exposing. Sometimes I'd rather, go bury my head in the sand and suppress it and not look at it. But triggers really are our friend, because they're a window into ourselves to be able to learn and grow and outgrow behaviors and negative feelings and perspectives we have that limit us in our lives. And the triggers we feel as women with the concepts that I teach, and having to look at ourselves and put that window on ourselves, that is the primary reason that for the good men who watch my channel and share my videos with your wives, the triggering aspect of having to look at ourselves and then getting stuck in those triggers, that's the primary reason that your wives get angry or won't watch my videos, is they're stuck in their triggers and they don't really have a way to see through that or work through that. That's why I teach what I teach and why I have my courses, because we have to be taught to have that self-awareness and go in and say, oh, what's that in me?